A few skeletons remain, hidden by thickets of weeds. You may have ridden past them, thinking that they were run-down granaries, chicken houses, or barns. But they are crumbling relics of our past. At the turn of the century, they created the town of Preston, which had more per capita than any other location on the Eastern Shore. For almost 100 years, they ruled Preston and the surrounding area. When Canning was king, canning was invented in France in 1810. For the first time, there was a safe way to preserve vegetables, fruits, sauces, soup, seafood, and meat. In the 1800s, canneries had rapidly multiplied throughout Europe and America. By 1880, Baltimore was the capital of the canning in the United States. Baltimore had it all: deep harbors, water teeming with crabs, oysters and fish, and access to some of the richest farmland. So it was only natural that the knowledge and wealth of Baltimore would drift across the Chesapeake Bay to the Eastern Shore. Some believe the first cannery on the Eastern Shore was built in 1856 in Dover, Delaware by Alden Richardson and James Robinson. Another early cannery was built by Colonel Wallace and his son in 1870 in Cambridge. It canned oysters, fruits, and vegetables. Herbert Goslin built a cannery in 1877 at Linkwood, about 4 miles southeast of Cambridge, to can his own apples and peaches. Dorchester, Talbot, Somerset, and Wicomico counties, with access to the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries, built canneries for crab meat, oysters, and other seafood. But Preston was landlocked. It had only the Choptank River and its tributaries. Instead, it was blessed with rich farmland, so its canneries processed fruits and vegetables. Preston canneries canned peas, lima beans, string beans, sweet potatoes, peaches, apples, and corn. But the tomato was king in Preston. We don't know for sure when some of the canneries in Preston appeared, but we know why: the tomato. Preston had the ideal climate for tomatoes. The tomato plant seemed to be designed for the aerated, moist, organic soils of Preston. Uncomfortably warm summer nights and a long growing season make tomatoes king in Preston. But tomatoes have a drawback: they're easily damaged in shipping. Their skins tear and they ripen quickly in summer heat. Canning was the solution. Most canneries in the Preston area only canned tomatoes, and they canned them from July through September, and they only stopped when the frost came.
A full moon in August is always glut week in tomatoes. And that week, every cannery that was around here was filled up with tomatoes. And I remember my dad used to, during the glut week, he would get on the phone and he would call all these different canneries to, well, can you take a load of tomatoes? And, well, no, we can't, we're loaded up for the day. And then he would call somebody else. And finally, after a while, he'd find a home for these tomatoes, and we would haul them there.
At the turn of the century and into the 1920s, canneries sprouted up like monopoly hotels, often changing ownership. In 1920, 41 of the 62 Caroline County canneries were operated in the surrounding area of Preston. In their heyday, canneries employed half of the local population and provided work for Baltimore residents and migrant labor as well. But the good times came to an end when the stock market crashed and the Depression arrived. The canneries closed. Only 8 canneries were in operation in 1935. The canneries would have a resurgence in World War II, but would never own the landscape as did in the 1920s. The first cannery in the Preston area was built in 1885 in Choptank by 2 brothers, Walter and William Wright. Choptank was the ideal location because it had the best water access. Steamboats could ship the canned goods from Choptank to Baltimore in a day. The first telephone installed in Preston was dedicated to the steamboats. Mr. Wright's daughter, Estelle Wright, born in 1890, recalled,
"The steamboats were the main thing in Choptank. 2 steamboats came from Baltimore each day. The steamboats stopped running at Choptank in 1931, but before that, it was a busy little place."
The second generation of Wright's factories expanded to Caroline and Talbot counties, canning under the label The Pride of Talbot.
But in my early years, I remember the canneries in Preston. In fact, my dad, I heard him say one time there was 3 canneries here in Preston, all running at the same time. One was the Wright Cannery, one was the Douglas Cannery, and one was the Leadenham Cannery. And of course, they were all competing against each other. But there was many acres of tomatoes grown in this area. Every farm had like 2 or 3 or 4 acres of tomatoes, and their children, in the summertime, they would pick tomatoes and earn a little bit of money so they could buy clothes for school.
More canneries began to appear in Preston throughout the late 1800s. Between 1885 and 1900, 7 canneries operated in the Preston area. The cannery owners were self-made men. Most hadn't attended college. Many didn't own farmland. They were Methodist and active Freemasons. The canneries had boom or bust cycles. When the railroad came to Preston in the 1890s, it offered faster and cheaper access to the large metropolitan markets. Preston was served by the Baltimore and Eastern Railroad. The locals called it the Black Cinders and Ashes Line. Its dirty coal-fired engines spewed smoke and cinders along the tracks. In dry weather, farmers would have to watch for small brush fires originating from the cinders spewing from their smokestacks. 2 daily freight trains shipped canned goods to metropolitan markets in Baltimore and Washington.
My dad, Lester Christopher, had a tomato cannery in the jumping little town of Hog Creek. There probably was a dozen houses total in the whole thing, but we had a fairly large cannery down there. And the steam whistle went off at 7 a.m. every morning, where the place was just sitting there idle and nobody moving, and a typical scene of Hog Creek. Once that whistle blew, all hell broke loose, literally. In addition to the employees all riding in and getting ready, set up and ready for work, the steam whistle meant that steam was up, the boiler was ready, and we were ready to start operations.
It started even before the 7 a.m. whistle. By 7 a.m., the first load of tomatoes had been picked.
And we would get up early in the morning, sometimes to beat the heat, and pick those tomatoes, and then we would load them on a truck and carry them to Mr. Christopher or Mr. Roy Gates.
My dad always raised tomatoes, and I grew up knowing what it was to help set them out and pick them and haul them and all that. And back in those years, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, we hauled tomatoes to several different canneries here in the Preston area.
In early spring, the cannery sold the farmers tomato plants and tomato baskets. By early July, the tomatoes were ready and the farmers brought full baskets to be counted. Cannery workers then dumped the baskets into a wooden tank filled with cold water for cleaning. Wooden paddles moved the tomatoes in the vat of cold water to remove the crusted Preston soil. A metal chain conveyor belt moved the washed tomatoes to their next station.
We had obviously a peeler ring where the tomatoes were peeled. They went around a circular conveyor.
The tomatoes continued on the conveyor belt into scalding hot water. The hot water blanched them and loosened their skins to make them easy to peel. Later, factories would use lye to loosen the skin. The conveyor belt dumped the scalding hot tomatoes into a bucket. When the bucket was full, a worker placed it on the conveyor belt, headed for the peeling station.
What I did, I skinned tomatoes. I had a spoon. I worked with a spoon. Some people had knives, little sharp knives, but I had a spoon. Would cut the core out and peel the skin off the tomato, you know.
Peelers used peeler knives that cut around the stem, allowing the tomato skin to peel off. She placed the peeled tomatoes into a pan emblazoned with her number. Peelers were paid piecemeal, and their buckets were tracked using each peeler's number.
A man came around and emptied our buckets, you know, and they gave us a ticket for so many buckets you skin a day, you know.
Before the 20th century, most of the canning work was done by hand. Labels were glued on by hand using a simple labeling board. Women would place glue on the label. Then they placed the glued label in an indentation on the board and wrapped the label onto the can. Cans were manually sealed by the tinsmithers. Both lids had to be hand soldered. The biggest invention for canneries in the 19th century was a double-seamed can. It speeded up production and ensured the cans were properly sealed. The new double-seamed cans could be sealed with a crimper. In the beginning, a manual crimper was used. Eventually, the crimper was mechanized. Cans were moved to the crimper on the conveyor belts, immediately sealed and sent to the steamer. The cannery was an overwhelming place. The noise from the machines and rattling conveyor belts was deafening. It was so loud that many cannery owners eventually lost their hearing. It was also extremely uncomfortable. It smelled of rotting tomatoes. The jobs were repetitive and dull. It was a tough environment to work in, but they worked together, black, white, and migrant workers, to the monotonous rhythm of the factory.
Wade in the water. Russell Thomas had a deep baritone voice, as I remember it. He would start singing spirituals, and he had an absolutely gorgeous voice. And he would get the thing started, and it would pick up by the peelers, and it just spread all the way around the peeling ring. Anybody that was in reasonable distance of it all joined in, and the whole cannery rocked.
We used to sing and pray when we worked in there. It was a joy because we didn't know what a prayer was at that time, and you met people that knew what and sing, went to church. You know, they would come in and sing to us, you know. They'd be working, but they would be singing, you know.
Well, that was a big thing. Those older ladies and my aunt, my uncle, Russell Thomas, he would get that ball rolling, and others would fall right in and sing and just peel those tomatoes like they were going out of style. So it was a happy thing. They made a good thing by doing that.
The sons and daughters of the factory owners worked alongside the factory workers. Most workers returned year after year. Almost all jobs required workers to stand for long periods of time in the oppressive heat and humidity.
It was hot. The sweat just rolled on. You had to have a towel, you know, because you didn't want your sweat to run into the tomatoes.
Peelers stood for 8 to 12 hours a day for 6 days a week, sometimes wearing rubber boots if they could afford them, because the floors were soaked with tomato juice, condensation from the steamers, and discarded tomato skins.
I used to look at the ladies and I didn't know how they could do it, but it's certainly an art to that, how they had a peeling knife and they peel the tomatoes and put them in a bucket and then they go around and they get a token. I just wondered how in the world they could peel so many so fast. My mother and sisters and cousins, like that. They all did it with a lot of expertise. They were good at it.
Although child labor laws were in effect, sometimes workers brought their children with them.
I had to be 13 or 14 because you couldn't work. It was a certain age you had to put in before you could start working, you know.
The children were quickly whisked away when inspectors appeared. An article published in 1918 in the Washington Post reported,
Out of 274 canneries in Maryland and Virginia, visited by inspectors of the Department of Labor, 1,094 children under 14 years of age were found to be at work. Children between the ages of 7 and 16 years could be found peeling tomatoes, husking corn, and preparing other vegetables. Those too small to reach the tables stood on boxes placed on wet and slippery floors.
Men filled boxes, carried cases of cans, emptied baskets of tomatoes into tubs, and did other jobs that required strength.
I rolled cans down from the loft, and I also done some stacking. Once they were in the cans, processed, I have to store them in the back room.
When the tomatoes come out of the boiler on the cans, they come out on a track and to a machine, and you would take your foot and your hand and put a box there and pull them in, and that would be like, I think, 24 cans. And it's full, then you take it off and you put it on the roller, and it would go to the warehouse.
The men stoking the boiler had the hardest job, shoveling coal into an open, roaring, blistering hot furnace. The migrant workers lived next to the canneries. The migrant facilities lacked running water, toilets, and they frequently slept on mattresses filled with straw. Dr. Plummer, the local doctor in Preston who treated many migrant workers, remarked, "The migrants lived in squalor. Their living conditions were awful. Most employers tried to provide migrants with sanitary facilities, and these were monitored by the health department, sometimes extremely well and sometimes not well." The canneries gave rise to other industries. Factories were built to make wooden boxes and tomato baskets. Brokerage businesses and trucking companies supported the canneries. One of the world's largest brokerages in the 1920s was A.W. Sisk & Son of Preston, Maryland. It is now the oldest continuously running company in Caroline County. Its brands, which include Red Glow, Pine Cone, Pride of the Farm, have been sold for 100 years. Eventually, the Eastern Shore canneries had to compete with California's 365-day growing season. As the prices for canned goods went down, the Eastern Shore canneries' margins became too slim. Workers demanded better working conditions, and the higher wages further cutting into their margins. Environmental protection regulations required proper waste disposal. Before that, canneries had dumped their waste directly into streams or ravines. Local residents complained about the smell of rotting tomatoes emanating from the canneries. The taste of the buying public changed from canned to frozen. Cannery owners could not afford to modernize. They were caught in a vicious cycle, unable to compete profitably. They could not afford to invest in technology to make their canneries profitable. Finally, they closed. The canneries are gone now. Produce is sold directly to metropolitan markets and in local farm stands. Farms are bigger now, but relics remain. Tokens, checks, and old cans are collectibles now.
It was just, in itself, was a wonderful thing, the days of the canneries. In the Venera, you might say, yeah.
And Preston, the town that the cannery industry built, is thriving. All reminders of when.